Continuing on with creating our first Android application, we now get presented with the option to choose the template we want to use to create our Android project. I'm going to be using an empty activity here, but as I mentioned in an earlier video, if the exact template isn't available because Google have perhaps changed things by the time you're watching this video, you don't need to worry about it. Just choose the one that's closest in appearance to what you see on the screen. In this case, I'm going to choose Empty Activity and click on Next. Now, just before Android Studio creates the project and generates the code for us, it's asking here for the name of the activity and the layout. Now, I am going to be talking about activities and layouts a bit later, but for now we can just accept the default names that Android Studio is suggesting. So you can see on the screen main activity and activity_main. And you'll see how both of these names are used when we get into the project. And if you did happen to choose another template that has, for example, got a menu, then this screen will also ask you for a name for that menu layout file and ask other questions if appropriate for the particular template you've chosen. Generally speaking, the suggested names are fine and quite descriptive, so we'll stick to those defaults. Now you can also see there's a couple of checkboxes on the screen, and normally you want to leave both of those checked. The first one, Generate Layout File, causes Android Studio to create a default layout file for the project, which essentially is the activity_main layout. Now, most applications would need at least one layout, or they wouldn't be able to display anything, so you may as well get Android Studio to create that file for you automatically. Now, if you're creating an app that will run as a service and have no user interface at all, then you would untick that box. The second one is backwards compatibility, and it's a good idea to keep that checkbox ticked as well. Now, if you untick the box, your app will only run on the latest version of Android. And I guess that's not strictly true because you can change the specific version, but what will happen there would be, by unchecking it, is that you'll be targeting a single version of Android and the app won't work on earlier versions. Now, I'm going to be explaining about app compat later. For now, really the only thing you need to do is make sure you leave that box ticked as well. And we're done with this screen, so I'm going to click on Finish. Android Studio has now taken the information that we've entered, and it's now creating the base project as you saw in the layouts video. You can see it's working down the bottom right hand corner there. And notice how briefly when we saw the code it was showing in red. That was Android Studio preparing things. Once it's now completed, the red errors disappeared and we've got an application now that has been created using that default template. And I did mention this in a previous video, but sometimes you will get a message here or at some point when you're working on Android projects like this. So if you do see something like this pop up, just click Sync Now, and that will get things happening and synced automatically for you. And that would generally clear the message on the screen and the project would be automatically built for you again. And just in case you're wondering what Gradle is, well, it's an open source build automation system. The task of Gradle is to pull together all the bits of the project to create the application file that can be installed on an Android device. If you use external libraries, such as the YouTube API that we'll be using in a later part of the course, then you can tell Gradle about them and it sorts everything out for you automatically. It's quite seriously pretty cool. But at this stage, you don't really need to know more than that because Android Studio runs Gradle for you when you come to run the application. The main point was that if you see that Sync Now pop up, click on that to update things. Let's go back to the code. Okay, so our project has now been created at this point. Now, different versions of Android Studio start showing a different file. So here I've got mainActivity.java, the file open, but you can see activity_main next to it on the tab to the top up here. Sometimes activity main will be the one initially displayed, but it doesn't actually really matter which one does because you can just click on the tab to switch between them anyway. Now, if you remember, those are the names that we gave to the files in that last part of the screen before the project was created. Or rather, I guess it's the names that Android Studio suggested that we accepted. So there's lots of things to talk about on the screen, and when looking at it right now, you might be thinking, wow, where do I start with all of this? But the thing to keep in mind with a lot of this is there's a lot of information on the screen, but you really don't need to understand a lot of that information. As we go through the course though, you'll understand what layouts are, for example, as well as widgets and so forth. Now we'll cover that in a later part of the course, but just keep into the back of your mind that this Android Studio application is very powerful and it really does enable you to create very complex applications. You don't need to know a lot about the advanced things yet, and in fact we're not going to be using some of those until later in the course. But I will be explaining things as I go along, so if you keep in mind that you can't understand everything at once, then it will all make sense eventually. So going through some of the fundamental things, I'm going to show you how to make a few little changes before we move on to start running this particular application. The first thing I'd like to mention is a rendering error that you can sometimes get if you have installed a preview version of the Android SDK. So I've mentioned previously that it's not a good idea to install preview versions when you're learning, because you really can't be sure if the error that you may have on the screen is a result of your coding or a bug in the actual SDK itself. So on the next screen, I'm going to show you a screenshot showing an error displaying the activity_main layout using the Android N preview version, just to give you a feel for the type of error you may get in that situation. So you can see down the bottom of the screen where it says rendering problems. Now that doesn't look good, and if that's the first thing you see when starting Android Studio, then it probably would be a bit scary, certainly might be a bit scary and even off-putting. Now there will be bugs in preview versions. If there were no bugs, they'd release it and it wouldn't be called a preview version anymore after all. But seeing things like that pop up when you're new to all of this can be quite scary. And actually, if you stop and think about it, it's obvious that the problem isn't something that you've done. You haven't entered any code yet, so the bug can't be yours after all. That doesn't really help in this situation though, because you still don't know what to do about it. So avoiding preview versions of Android until you've had a lot of experience and have become confident sorting out problems is definitely recommended. As it happens, the solution to this problem is to tell Android Studio not to use the preview version to render the layout, and we'll look at that in a second. Now, it is possible that you'll get a rendering error even if you're not using the preview version. That does happen from time to time, and that particular error I'm thinking of is similar to this. So if you do happen to get an error like that, you notice how it was a little bit different to the previous error, you need to go to the File menu in Android Studio and choose the option to invalidate caches/restart. So let me go back to Android Studio and just to show you how to do that. So here we are back in Android Studio. So we could just go up to File, Invalidate Caches, Restart. Again, you'd only need to do that if you did happen to get that error. And then click on Invalidate and Restart. And you can see that Android Studio restarted and reloaded the project. Down the bottom right hand corner you can see that there's now a progress bar and it's going through building the application again. So we'll just give that a moment to finish. Okay, you can see that it's now finished. So I'm going to pause the video here now. In the next video we're going to start having a bit of a look around and starting off by finding out a little bit more about the layout. See you in the next video.